In the harsh winter of 1889, 9 Kiowa children stumbled through knee-deep snow toward a cabin that most folks said was cursed. Their faces were gaunt, their breath came in ragged gasps, and fever burned behind their eyes like dying embers. The man they sought was known throughout the Colorado Territory as the Silent Healer, a recluse who hadn't spoken to another soul in 3 years, not since the day his own family perished from the same disease now ravaging these children. What happened next would shake the very foundations of Medicine Creek Township and prove that sometimes the most broken souls possess the greatest power to heal. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches, you make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cabin perched on the edge of Whispering Ridge like a wounded bird clinging to its nest. Built from hand-hewn pine logs and chinked with red clay, it stood defiant against the mountain winds that howled down from the peaks each winter night. Smoke curled from its chimney, the only sign that someone still dwelt within its weathered walls. Dr. Samuel Thornfield had chosen this isolation deliberately. 3 winters had passed since he'd last walked the streets of Medicine Creek Township. 3 winters since he'd last spoken a word to another human being. The townspeople called him the Silent Healer now, though they remembered when his voice had filled the church on Sundays, when his laughter had echoed from the general store, when children had run to greet him on the dusty main street. That man seemed like a stranger now, buried beneath layers of grief as thick as the snow that blanketed his mountain refuge. Samuel's days followed a rhythm as precise as clockwork. He rose before dawn, fed the handful of goats that provided his milk, and cheese, chopped wood until his shoulders ached, and tended to the small garden he'd carved from the rocky soil. His hands, once steady enough to perform the most delicate surgeries, now found their purpose in simpler tasks, mending harnesses, grinding herbs, preserving meat for the long months ahead. The silence had become his companion, as familiar as his own breathing. He no longer jumped at the crack of settling timber or the sudden call of a hawk. Instead, he moved through his routine with the careful precision of a man who had learned to live entirely within himself. His medical bag sat untouched on a shelf beside the door, leather cracked from disuse, the instruments within growing dull from neglect. Sometimes, on clear mornings when the air was sharp enough to cut glass, Samuel would stand on his porch and look down toward the valley where Medicine Creek Township lay, like a collection of child's blocks scattered across the prairie. He could see the white spire of the church, where he'd once been married, the red roof of the schoolhouse where his daughter Emma had learned her letters, the cemetery where 3 wooden crosses now marked the graves of everything he'd lost. Dr. Marcus Holbrook had taken over the town's medical practice after Samuel's retreat to the mountain. Holbrook was a competent physician trained in Chicago with modern ideas about medicine and surgery. He'd arrived in Medicine Creek Township with leather satchels full of the latest instruments and a confidence that impressed the town council. Yet for all his credentials, Holbrook lacked something that Samuel had possessed in abundance: the gentle touch that could calm a frightened child, the instinct that sensed sickness before symptoms appeared, the willingness to sit beside a dying man through the longest night. The townspeople respected Holbrook, but they had loved Samuel Thornfield. Even now, 3 years after his self-imposed exile, they spoke his name with a mixture of reverence and sorrow. Old Martha Wessington still left baskets of preserves at the base of the mountain trail, though she never climbed high enough to reach his cabin. Young Timothy Chen, whose broken arm Samuel had set with such care that it healed stronger than before, would sometimes ride his horse to the lower slopes and call Samuel's name into the wind, hoping for an answer that never came. The tragedy that had driven Samuel to his mountain hermitage was whispered about in parlors and discussed in hushed tones at church suppers, but never spoken of directly in his presence during those final days before he disappeared into the wilderness. Scarlet fever had swept through Medicine Creek Township like wildfire in the autumn of 1886. It had started with the Hendricks family, claiming first their youngest boy, then spreading house by house until half the town lay sick and desperate. Samuel had worked without rest for weeks, moving from bedside to bedside with his black bag and his gentle hands, fighting a disease that seemed to mock every remedy he possessed. His wife Elizabeth had worked beside him, brewing teas and spooning broth to fevered lips, her brown hair tied back with strips of cloth torn from her own petticoats. Their daughter Emma, barely 7 years old, had helped by carrying water and holding frightened children's hands while her father worked. The fever took Elizabeth first, burning through her body with a speed that left Samuel helpless, despite all his knowledge. He'd held her hand as she slipped away, whispering promises he knew he couldn't keep, watching the light fade from eyes that had been his anchor for 15 years. Emma followed 3 days later, her small body unable to fight what had claimed her mother. Samuel had sat beside her bed for 2 days and nights after she passed, his hands folded in his lap, his voice finally broken into silence. The town had buried them on a grey November morning when the first snow was beginning to fall. Samuel had stood beside the graves in his black coat, his face carved from stone, receiving condolences he could not hear through the roaring in his ears. Pastor Williams had spoken of God's mysterious ways and eternal rest. But Samuel heard only the wind cutting through bare branches and the hollow sound of dirt striking wood. Within a week of the funeral, he had packed his few remaining possessions, loaded them onto a mule, and disappeared into the mountains. The townspeople had sent search parties at first, fearing he might do himself harm in his grief. They found his tracks leading up the old mining trail toward Whispering Ridge, but the snow had covered them before they could follow further. Some said he had perished in the wilderness. Others claimed they sometimes saw smoke rising from the high country, suggesting he had found shelter and chosen to remain hidden. The truth lay somewhere between legend and reality. Samuel had indeed found the abandoned cabin on Whispering Ridge, a structure built decades earlier by a prospector who had died alone with his dreams of gold. The roof leaked, the windows were cracked, and mice had made nests in the corners, but it offered 4 walls and a stone fireplace that could hold back the mountain cold. Samuel had spent that first winter repairing what he could with numb fingers and a heart that felt equally frozen. He patched the roof with pine bark and clay, replaced the broken window panes with oiled paper, and slowly transformed the ruin into something resembling a home. Yet it was a home without laughter, without conversation, without the small daily joys that make a house more than mere shelter. His medical training proved invaluable in ways he hadn't expected. He learned which mountain plants could ease pain, which roots could settle a stomach, which berries were safe to eat when his preserved food ran low. His hands, denied their purpose of healing others, found new skills in tanning hides, smoking meat, and building furniture from fallen timber. The precision that had once guided his scalpel now directed his axe and saw. The isolation had not been chosen lightly. Samuel knew that in town, well-meaning friends would try to draw him back into the world of the living. They would speak of moving forward, of God's plan, of the duty he owed to the community that still needed his healing touch. But Samuel also knew that his heart had been carved hollow, that the mere sight of a sick child would bring back memories too sharp to bear. Better to remain in the mountains where only the wind spoke to him, where the silence could not be broken by a child's cry or a mother's desperate plea for help. He had failed when it mattered most, failed to save his wife, failed to save his daughter, failed to be the healer his family had needed. What right did he have to tend others when he couldn't protect those he loved most? Yet even in his self-imposed exile, Samuel remained a doctor at his core. He kept his medical bag nearby, its leather worn soft from years of use. Sometimes on restless nights when sleep would not come, he would open it and touch the instruments. Within, the bone saw that had saved countless limbs, the forceps that had delivered dozens of babies, the bottles that had once held remedies for every common ailment. His hands would remember their purpose, muscle memory, guiding fingers that had once moved with the confidence of a master craftsman. But always, the memory of his failure would rise like smoke, choking off any thought of returning to practice. He would close the bag, secure its brass clasps, and return it to its shelf where it gathered dust like a relic of another man's life. The mountain seasons had taught Samuel new rhythms. Spring brought the responsibility of planting. Summer demanded constant vigilance against drought and pests. Autumn required preparation for the harsh months ahead. Winter was both the cruelest and most honest season, stripping away all pretense, demanding only survival. During those long winter nights, when the wind screamed down from the peaks and snow piled against his door, Samuel would sit by the fire and read by lamplight. He had brought few books with him, his medical texts, a volume of poetry Elizabeth had loved, the Bible that had been his mother's. But he read them over and over, finding new meanings in familiar words, letting the rhythm of language fill the silence that pressed against his walls. Sometimes he would find himself speaking aloud to the flames, his voice rusty from disuse. He would discuss a particularly challenging passage with the fire, debate the merits of different treatments with his reflection in the window, or simply recite poetry to hear human words in the vast quiet. But these moments were rare, and he always caught himself quickly, remembering that even his own voice felt like an intrusion in the sanctuary of silence he had built. The townspeople below continued their lives without him. Births and deaths, marriages and funerals, the endless cycle of human joy and sorrow that he had once been part of as both witness and participant. Sometimes, on clear days, he could see the smoke rising from chimneys in the valley, could make out the tiny figures moving along the main street like ants in their purposeful business, but they seemed as distant as stars, inhabitants of a world he had chosen to leave behind. Dr. Holbrook's practice thrived in his absence. The younger man's modern methods impressed patients who had grown used to Samuel's more traditional approach. Holbrook used newer medicines, employed techniques learned in the great hospitals of the East, and spoke with the confidence of a man who had never watched his own family slip away despite his best efforts. Yet there remained cases that stumped the new doctor, ailments that required not just medical knowledge but intuition, the kind of deep understanding of human nature that comes only from years of holding others' pain as if it were your own. In these moments, some of the older residents would look toward the mountains and wonder what Samuel Thornfield might have done differently. As winter deepened around his cabin, Samuel had no way of knowing that far below in the valley, another kind of sickness was beginning to spread. Not scarlet fever this time, but something else, something that would soon drive desperate families to seek help from places they had never thought to look. The mountain silence that had been his refuge was about to be shattered by voices he could not ignore. Young voices, crying out in pain and fear, voices that would call him back from the edge of the world he had built around his broken heart. Tashiti. Snow continued to fall, covering his tracks, burying his footprints, erasing all evidence of the man who lived alone on Whispering Ridge. But some storms, Samuel would soon learn, are strong enough to uncover what has been hidden, and some cries for help can penetrate even the deepest silence. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The first signs of trouble appeared in Medicine Creek Township on a Tuesday morning when young Billy Patterson collapsed during arithmetic lessons at the schoolhouse. Miss Catherine Wright, the schoolmarm, rushed to his side as he convulsed. On the wooden floor, his small body racked with tremors that seemed to come from somewhere deep within his bones. His skin burned with fever, yet he shivered as though winter had settled into his very marrow. Dr. Marcus Holbrook arrived within the hour, his black medical bag swinging from his hand as he strode through the schoolhouse door with the confidence of a man accustomed to solving problems through modern science. He examined Billy with practiced efficiency, checking his pulse, listening to his breathing through the new stethoscope he'd ordered from Chicago, taking his temperature with a mercury thermometer that gleamed silver in the lamplight. But for all his instruments and training, Holbrook found himself puzzled. The boy's symptoms defied easy classification. The fever spiked and fell in irregular patterns. The tremors came and went without warning, and there was something in Billy's eyes, a distant, glassy stare that suggested the sickness had reached deeper than flesh and bone, touching something more fundamental. "Exhaustion," Holbrook announced to Billy's anxious parents, Charles and Margaret Patterson, who had rushed from their dry goods store the moment word reached them. "Perhaps a touch of influenza complicated by malnutrition. The boy's been working. Too hard, not eating enough. A few days of rest and proper nutrition should set him right." But even as he spoke the words, Holbrook felt a nagging doubt in the pit of his stomach. He had seen influenza countless times during his training in the city hospitals, had treated dozens of cases of childhood exhaustion and malnutrition. This was something else, something that made his carefully trained instincts whisper warnings. He couldn't quite interpret. Margaret Patterson gathered her son in her arms, her face pale with worry. "Doctor, his skin feels wrong somehow, not just hot, but different, like it's burning from the inside out." She looked up at Holbrook with the desperate hope that only a mother's fear can produce. "You're certain it's nothing more serious?" Holbrook's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He had built his reputation on certainty, on the modern medical man's confidence in diagnosis and treatment. To admit uncertainty would undermine everything he had worked to establish in this frontier community. "Mrs. Patterson, I've seen cases like this in Chicago. The important thing is to keep the boy cool, give him plenty of fluids, and ensure he gets proper rest. I'll prepare a tonic that should help with the fever." But as the days passed, Billy Patterson did not improve. If anything, the mysterious sickness seemed to deepen its hold on him. His fever spiked higher, the tremors became more violent, and he began to speak in fragments, muttering words in languages no one recognized, crying out names that belonged to no one in Medicine Creek Township. Word of Billy's condition spread through the small community with the speed that only genuine fear can achieve. Neighbors gathered in hushed groups outside the general store, sharing theories and remedies passed down from grandmothers and folk healers. Some blamed the unusually harsh winter. Others pointed to the strange green lights that had danced across the northern sky just weeks before Billy fell ill. Mrs. Eleanor Hawthorne, the banker's wife and self-appointed keeper of town morality, declared it was divine judgment for some unnamed sin. "Mark my words," she announced from her seat on the church auxiliary committee, "when the Lord sends sickness to test us, it's because we've strayed from righteous paths. Perhaps we should examine our own consciences before seeking earthly remedies." But her religious pronouncements offered little comfort to the Patterson family, who watched their eldest son waste away despite Dr. Holbrook's increasingly desperate treatments. The modern tonics and medicines that had seemed so promising proved useless against whatever force was consuming Billy from within. Then, on the following Sunday, disaster struck with the sudden fury of a mountain avalanche. Sarah Chen, daughter of the Chinese merchant who ran the town's only restaurant, collapsed during morning services. Her symptoms mirrored Billy's exactly: the spiking fever, the violent tremors, the distant stare that suggested her mind had traveled somewhere beyond the reach of ordinary medicine. Within hours, 3 more children had fallen ill. Tommy Reeves, son of the blacksmith, began shaking uncontrollably while helping his father shoe horses. Little Mary O'Brien, barely 5 years old, was found by her mother lying unconscious in the family vegetable garden, her small body burning. With the same inexplicable fever that had claimed the others, Dr. Holbrook found himself facing a medical crisis unlike anything his training had prepared him for. The hospital wards he'd worked in Chicago had dealt with epidemics, but those had followed predictable patterns: cholera spreading through contaminated water, typhoid fever moving along well-documented pathways of transmission. This sickness seemed to choose its victims at random, striking healthy children from different families, different neighborhoods, different social classes. By Wednesday afternoon, 6 children lay sick in their beds, and panic began to take hold of medicine. Greek Township with iron claws. Parents kept their healthy children indoors, shops closed early, and the normally bustling main street became a corridor of fearful whispers and hurried footsteps. The church bells, which usually rang cheerfully to mark the hours, now tolled, with the somber rhythm reserved for times of communal mourning. Mayor Franklin Cartwright called an emergency town meeting in the church basement, the oil lamps casting nervous shadows on the stone walls as worried families gathered to demand answers that no one could provide. Dr. Holbrook stood before them, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled from sleepless nights spent moving between sick rooms, his confidence visibly shaken. "I've consulted my medical texts," he announced to the assembled crowd, his voice lacking its usual authority. "I've telegraphed colleagues in Denver and Kansas City seeking advice. This appears to be some form of neurological fever, possibly transmitted through—" He paused, realizing that his technical explanations offered no comfort to parents whose children lay dying. "What you're saying, Doctor," interrupted Jacob Thornton, whose daughter lay among the afflicted, "is that you don't know what's killing our children, and you don't know how to stop it." The silence that followed was heavier than any accusation. Holbrook's hands clenched at his sides, his face flushing with the particular shame that comes from professional failure witnessed by an entire community. "Modern medicine," he said slowly, "sometimes requires time to identify new pathologies. I'm doing everything within my power. Everything within your power isn't enough." The shout came from Charles Patterson, whose son Billy had now been sick for nearly 2 weeks. "My boy is dying, and all you can offer is fancy words from your city books." The crowd murmured its agreement, fear and frustration building like steam in a covered pot. These were practical people, farmers and merchants and craftsmen who solved problems with their hands and their backs. They had little patience for medical mysteries that couldn't be fixed with hard work and common sense. It was then that Martha Wessington, ancient and bent but still sharp as winter wind, rose slowly from her seat in the back row. Her cane tapped against the stone floor as she made her way forward, her voice cutting through the nervous chatter like a blade through cloth. "There's another doctor in these parts," she said, her words carrying the weight of years and the authority of someone who had outlived most of her contemporaries. A man who understood sickness in ways that go deeper than what you can read in books. The crowd stilled. Even Dr. Holbrook found himself listening as Martha continued, her grey eyes fixed on something beyond the lamplight. "Samuel Thornfield saved more lives in this town than any of you can count. He had hands that could feel sickness before it showed itself, eyes that could see what needed healing even when it was hidden." "Mrs. Wessington," Mayor Cartwright said gently, "Dr. Thornfield hasn't practiced medicine in 3 years. He's chosen a life of solitude. We can't simply—" "Can't what?" Martha's voice cracked like a whip. "Can't ask him to help. Save children who are dying while we sit here arguing about pride and protocols. Samuel Thornfield lost his own family to sickness. True enough. But that doesn't mean he's forgotten how to heal. It means he understands suffering in ways the rest of us never will. Pastor Williams shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had counseled Samuel through those dark days after Elizabeth and Emma's deaths, had watched a man of deep faith struggle with questions that had no easy answers. Mrs. Wessington, Dr. Thornfield, is deeply traumatized by his losses. To ask him to treat sick children might be cruel, might reopen wounds that have barely begun to heal. Cruel. Martha's laugh was bitter as burnt coffee. You know what's cruel? Letting children die because we're too polite to disturb a man's grief. Samuel Thornfield took an oath once, same as any doctor. That oath doesn't disappear just because his heart got broken. The debate continued for another hour, voices rising and falling like waves against a rocky shore. Some argued that Samuel had forfeited his right to practice medicine when he abandoned the community in its time of need. Others insisted that his past successes earned him the benefit of any doubt. A few suggested that his current isolation might have driven him mad, making him more dangerous than helpful. But as the meeting dragged on and no solutions emerged, desperation began to outweigh all other considerations. Parents who had entered the church with reservations about disturbing Samuel's exile found themselves willing to try anything, even approaches that their rational minds rejected. Finally, it was Sheriff Tom Bradley who cut through the debate with the practical wisdom of a man who had spent years dealing with problems that required action rather than discussion. "Folks," he said, rising from his seat near the door, "we can argue all night about whether Dr. Thornfield can help our children, or we can climb that mountain and ask him ourselves. Seems to me the children don't have time for us to reach a consensus." The vote, when it came, was closer than many expected. 17 families voted to send a delegation to Whispering Ridge, 14 voted against disturbing Samuel's isolation, and 3 abstained entirely. But in matters of life and death, a simple majority carried the weight of absolute authority. Sheriff Bradley volunteered to lead the expedition, along with Pastor Williams, Mayor Cartwright, and, despite his obvious reluctance, Dr. Holbrook himself. They would leave at first light, following the old mining trail up into the high country where Samuel Thornfield had built his hermitage of grief and silence. As the meeting disbanded and families drifted back to their homes through the cold night air, the sound of children's fevered breathing seemed to echo from every window. 7 children now lay sick, their parents maintaining vigil beside beds that might become biers if no help could be found. In the house at the end of Maple Street, where the Patterson family kept their desperate watch, young Billy tossed in his viva dreams, speaking fragments of sentences that made no sense to his exhausted parents. The mountain sees everything. The silent one knows the old ways. His words dissolved into mumbling, but Margaret Patterson found herself looking toward the window, toward the dark outline of Whispering Ridge silhouetted against the starlit sky, wondering if somewhere in that wilderness lived the answer to her prayers. Dawn broke gray and bitter over Medicine Creek Township, the kind of morning that promised snow before nightfall. Sheriff Tom Bradley stood in his kitchen, methodically checking his sidearm and filling his saddlebags with provisions for the mountain journey ahead. His wife, Clara, packed jerky and hardtack with the efficient movements of a woman who had sent her husband into uncertain situations more times than she cared to count. "You sure about this, Tom?" she asked, her hands never pausing in their work. "Samuel Thornfield made his choice 3 years ago. Maybe we ought to respect it." Bradley holstered his pistol, the leather creaking against his hip. 7 children. Sick and getting worse, Clara. Billy Patterson's been unconscious since yesterday. If there's even a chance Samuel can help. He left the sentence unfinished, but Clara understood. In their 23 years of marriage, she had learned to read the weight her husband carried when other people's lives hung in the balance. Across town, Pastor Williams knelt beside his bed in the pre-dawn darkness, his weathered hands clasped. In prayer, the words came haltingly, rusty from years of offering comfort to others, while his own faith wrestled with questions that had no easy answers. He prayed for the sick children, for wisdom in the journey ahead, and, though he barely admitted it to himself, for forgiveness for what they were about to ask of a man who had already sacrificed more than anyone should bear. Williams had been the one to perform the funeral services for Elizabeth and Emma Thornfield, had watched Samuel's face turn to granite as dirt fell on the coffins of his world. The pastor knew that climbing Whispering Ridge meant asking Samuel to face the very demons that had driven him to exile. Yet what choice did they have when children's lives hung in the balance? Dr. Marcus Holbrook paced his office like a caged wolf, his usually perfect appearance disheveled from 3 sleepless nights spent moving between sick rooms. Medical journals lay scattered across his desk, their pages marked with desperate notes and theories that led nowhere. He had telegraphed colleagues in Denver, Kansas City, even as far as Boston, describing the symptoms in precise clinical language. The responses had been uniformly unhelpful. Some suggested scarlet fever, others pointed toward meningitis or typhoid. One professor from Harvard Medical School had written a lengthy response about tropical diseases, possibly brought by railroad workers from distant regions. But none of the proposed treatments had shown any effect on the stricken children. Holbrook's hands shook slightly as he packed his medical bag for the mountain journey. His reputation, built so carefully over 3 years of successful practice, now hung by threads as thin as spider silk. Every parent who looked at him with desperate eyes saw his failure reflected back. Every colleague he had telegraphed would soon learn that the confident young doctor from Chicago had been stumped by a frontier illness. The prospect of approaching Samuel Thornfield filled Holbrook with emotions he struggled to name. Professional jealousy warred with genuine respect. Wounded pride battled against the desperate hope that someone, anyone, might succeed where he had failed. He had heard the stories, of course, whispered with the reverence usually reserved for legends. Samuel's almost supernatural ability to diagnose illness, his gentle hands that could calm the most frightened patient, his success rate that had made him famous throughout the territory. Mayor Franklin Cartwright joined the expedition with visible reluctance, his political instincts warning him that disturbing Samuel's chosen exile could backfire spectacularly. If Samuel refused to help, or worse, if his 3 years of isolation had left him incapable of practicing medicine, the failure would reflect on Cartwright's leadership. But the alternative, explaining to grieving parents why he hadn't exhausted every possible avenue, seemed far worse. The 4 men met at the livery stable as the sun climbed pale and cold above the eastern mountains. Their horses stamped and snorted in the frigid air, breath rising like ghosts around their muzzles. Jake Morrison, the stable owner, checked their saddles with the extra care of a man who knew mountain weather could turn deadly without warning. "Trail's been snowed over since the last storm," Morrison warned, his grizzled face serious as stone. "Ice under the powder in places where the sun don't reach. You'll want to lead the horses through the narrow sections, trust their footing more than your own." He handed Bradley a coil of rope and a bag of grain, in case you get stuck up there longer than expected. The climb began gradually, following the old mining road that switchbacked up the mountain's eastern face. For the first hour, the going was relatively easy, the horses sure-footed on familiar ground that dozens of prospectors had traveled in years past. The men rode mostly in silence, each lost in his own thoughts as the town fell away below them. Pastor Williams found himself remembering the last conversation he'd had with Samuel, just days before the doctor disappeared into the mountains. Samuel had sat in the church pew like a man carved from wood, his eyes hollow, his hands folded in his lap with the stillness of absolute defeat. "I can't save anyone, Pastor," he had whispered, the words barely audible above the wind rattling the windows. "What good is a healer who couldn't heal his own family? What right do I have to touch another patient when my touch failed them?" Williams had offered the usual consolations: God's mysterious ways, the limits of human knowledge, the comfort that Elizabeth and Emma were now beyond suffering. But he had seen in Samuel's eyes that such words, however well-intentioned, could not penetrate the wall of guilt and grief that had risen around the doctor's heart like a fortress built to keep the world at bay. As they climbed higher, the trail became more treacherous. Snow lay deeper here, untouched by the winter sun, and the horses had to break through drifts that reached their bellies. The men dismounted and led their animals, their boots crunching through snow that squeaked with the particular sound of temperatures well below freezing. Dr. Holbrook struggled more than the others, his city-bred constitution unaccustomed to the demands of mountain travel. His breath came in sharp gasps, his face red with exertion and cold. Sheriff Bradley noticed the younger man's difficulty and quietly took the reins of Holbrook's horse, leading both animals while the doctor focused on simply putting one foot in front of the other. "Never been this high before?" Holbrook admitted, during a rest stop, his words forming small clouds in the thin air. In Chicago, the biggest hill was the steps up to the hospital. Despite his exhaustion, there was something approaching wonder in his voice as he looked out over the valley spread below them like a patchwork quilt of snow-covered fields and timber. Mayor Cartwright checked his pocket watch, a nervous habit that had intensified since the children fell ill. "How much farther, you reckon?" he asked Sheriff Bradley, who had hunted these mountains for 2 decades and knew their moods as well as any man could. "Another 2 hours, maybe 3 if the snow gets deeper," Bradley replied, scanning the trail ahead where it disappeared around. A rocky outcropping. The old mining camps just beyond that ridge. Samuel's cabin should be maybe half a mile past that. They pressed on, the silence broken only by the crunch of snow, the heavy breathing of men and horses, and the occasional crack of ice-laden branches in the wind. The air grew thinner as they climbed, each breath requiring more effort, each step demanding greater determination. Yet they continued, driven by the memory of children's fevered faces and the weight of parental desperation that had sent them into the wilderness. The abandoned mining camp appeared like a ghost town carved from ice and shadow. Wooden structures leaned at impossible angles. Their roofs collapsed under the weight of accumulated snow, their broken windows staring like empty eye sockets. Rusted mining equipment lay scattered among the buildings, ore cars tilted on their sides, pickaxes with rotted handles, the skeletal remains of a stamping mill that had once processed dreams of gold into bitter reality. Pastor Williams dismounted and walked among the ruins, his boots breaking through snow that had drifted undisturbed for years. He found a small cemetery at the camp's edge, wooden crosses marking graves of miners who had died far from home, their names weathered away by wind and time. The sight reminded him uncomfortably of the fresh graves in Medicine Creek Cemetery, of the possibility that more might be needed if their mission failed. "Cheerful place," muttered Mayor Cartwright, pulling his coat tighter against the wind that howled through the broken buildings. No wonder Samuel chose to live even higher than this. A man could disappear completely up here. Sheriff Bradley studied the trail beyond the camp, noting where it narrowed to little more than a footpath carved into the mountain's side. "From here on, we go single file. Watch for ice under the snow, and don't look down if heights bother you. It's a long way to the bottom." Dr. Holbrook stared up at the final stretch of trail, his face pale with something beyond mere cold. The path seemed to climb directly into the grey sky, disappearing among rocks and twisted pines that clung to life in the most impossible places. For a moment, he wondered if they were making a terrible mistake, if their desperation had led them to attempt something that bordered on madness. But then He thought of little Mary O'Brien, whose fever had spiked so high the night before that her skin felt like touching a coal from the fire. He thought of Billy Patterson, who hadn't opened his eyes in 2 days. He thought of his own reputation, crumbling with each passing hour that brought no improvement in his patient's conditions. The final approach to Samuel's cabin tested every man's resolve. The trail wound through stands of pine and aspen that creaked ominously in the wind, their snow-laden branches forming a tunnel of white that blocked most of the pale sunlight. In several places, the path had been partially washed away by spring runoff, leaving gaps that had to be carefully navigated on foot while leading the nervous horses. Sheriff Bradley went first, testing each step before signaling the others to follow. Behind him, Pastor Williams muttered prayers under his breath, his usual eloquence reduced to simple pleas for safe passage. Mayor Cartwright cursed softly but continuously, his political composure cracking under the strain of physical demands his office had never required. Dr. Holbrook brought up the rear, his medical bag clutched against his chest like a talisman, his city shoes slipping on rocks made treacherous by ice. When they finally emerged from the tree line, the cabin stood before them like something from a frontier fairy tale. Smoke rose, steady and straight from its stone chimney, suggesting warmth and life within walls that had weathered countless mountain storms. The structure itself was smaller than they had expected, built for practicality rather than comfort, but it radiated the kind of solid permanence that spoke of skilled hands and careful planning. A small garden plot lay buried under snow, its neat rows marked by stakes that protruded like exclamation points through the white blanket. A lean-to shelter protected a cord of split wood, stacked with the precision of a man who understood that winter survival depended on attention to detail. Nearby, a handful of goats huddled in a pen built from lodgepole pine, their shaggy coats dusted with snow, their breath forming small clouds in the bitter air. Sheriff Bradley dismounted and approached the cabin slowly, his boots crunching on snow that had clearly been walked on recently. Human footprints led from the door to the goat pen, from the pen to the woodpile, from the woodpile back to the door in the careful pattern of daily routine. The sight filled him with relief. Samuel Thornfield was not only alive, but maintaining the kind of disciplined schedule that suggested mental stability rather than the madness some had feared. The cabin's single window glowed with lamplight, and through the frost-covered glass they could see the shadow of a man moving with deliberate purpose. Sheriff Bradley raised his hand to knock, then hesitated, suddenly aware of the magnitude of what they were about to ask. They were not simply seeking medical consultation, but demanding that a man confront the very trauma that had driven him to this mountain exile. Pastor Williams stepped beside the sheriff, his own hand raised toward the heavy wooden door. "Samuel," he called, his voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. "It's Pastor Williams from town. We need to speak with you. It's about the children." The movement inside the cabin stopped abruptly. The lamplight flickered as though someone had passed quickly in front of it, then remained steady. Long seconds stretched into a full minute before the sound of footsteps approached the door. Slow, measured steps that suggested careful consideration rather than eager welcome. The door opened with a creak of hinges that hadn't been oiled in months, revealing a figure that bore only passing resemblance to the Samuel Thornfield they remembered. His hair had grown long and wild, his beard untrimmed and streaked with premature grey. His clothes were practical mountain wear, wool shirt, leather, vest, canvas pants tucked into boots that had seen hard use. But his eyes, grey as winter sky, remained sharp and intelligent, missing nothing as they studied the four men who had invaded his sanctuary. Samuel's gaze lingered longest on Dr. Holbrook, taking in the younger man's expensive coat, his carefully groomed appearance, the medical bag that marked him as the new healer of Medicine Creek Township. Something shifted in Samuel's expression, not jealousy or resentment, but a kind of weary recognition, as though he were looking at a reflection of his former self. "Pastor," Samuel said finally, his voice rusty from disuse, but still carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being heard. It was the first word he had spoken to another human being in over 6 months, and it seemed to surprise him as much as his visitors. He cleared his throat, the sound harsh in the mountain stillness. "Gentlemen, you've traveled far." Sheriff Bradley stepped forward, removing his hat despite the cold. "Dr. Thornfield, we wouldn't have come if it wasn't urgent. There are children sick in town, 7 of them now, maybe more by the time we get back. Dr. Holbrook here has done everything he can, but—" He gestured helplessly, words failing him. Samuel's eyes sharpened, his medical instincts stirring, despite 3 years of deliberate suppression. "What are the symptoms?" The question emerged automatically, trained responses overriding his carefully constructed isolation. Dr. Holbrook found his voice, professional terminology providing refuge from the emotional weight of the moment. High fever with irregular spikes, violent tremors, progressive neurological deterioration. The patients become unresponsive, speaking in what appears to be delirium. None of the standard treatments have shown any efficacy. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his gaze turning toward the valley below, where the town lay hidden in morning shadows. When he looked back at his visitors, something had changed in his expression. A flicker of the man he had once been, the healer who had never turned away from suffering, no matter how hopeless it seemed. "How long have they been sick?" he asked, stepping back from the doorway in what might have been invitation. "The first boy, Billy Patterson, collapsed 9 days ago," Pastor Williams said. "The others have fallen ill in the days since. Dr. Holbrook believes it may be some form of epidemic, though the pattern of transmission is—" He searched for diplomatic words. "Unknown," Holbrook finished flatly. "I've exhausted every resource at my disposal. The children are dying, Dr. Thornfield, and I don't know how to save them." The admission hung in the cold air like a challenge and a confession combined. Samuel studied the younger doctor's face, seeing in it the particular agony that comes when training and confidence collide with the harsh reality of medicine's limitations. He remembered that feeling, the way it could hollow out a man's chest and leave him questioning everything he thought he knew about healing. But before Samuel could respond, another sound reached them through the mountain stillness, the distant jingle of bells and the soft thud of footsteps in snow. From the tree line below emerged a sight that stopped all conversation. 9 figures moving in single file up the mountain trail, their progress slow but determined despite the treacherous conditions. Sheriff Bradley's hand moved instinctively toward his sidearm before his eyes adjusted, and he realized these were not adults approaching but children. 9 children, their ages ranging from perhaps 6 to 14. Their clothing marking them as members of the Kiowa tribe that had established a small settlement in the valley's eastern reaches. The oldest, a boy of perhaps 13 or 14, led the group with the careful steps of someone navigating familiar but dangerous terrain. His name was Joseph Crowfeather, and though the white men watching from the cabin porch didn't know it, he was the grandson of Chief Standing Bear, carrying in his young shoulders the weight of leadership passed down through generations of warriors and healers. Behind Joseph came his sister Dancing Moon, barely 11, but moving with the grace of someone who had learned early to find her footing on uncertain ground. Her long black hair was braided with beads that caught what little sunlight filtered through the overcast sky, and she carried a bundle wrapped in buffalo hide that seemed precious beyond its simple appearance. The other children followed in order. Of age, Little Wolf, whose name belied his small stature but matched his fierce determination. Sarah Windwalker, who despite being only 9 years old, had already shown the healing gifts that ran in her family's bloodline. Thomas Singing Bird, whose cheerful nature had earned him friends among both Kiowa and white children in the valley. Below, what struck the watching men most powerfully was not the children's presence, unexpected as it was, but their obvious illness. Even from a distance, the signs were unmistakable. The labored breathing that sent puffs of vapor into the cold air, the way they leaned on each other for support, the tremors that periodically shook their small frames. These children carried the same sickness that was devastating Medicine Creek Township, yet they had somehow found the strength to climb thousands of feet up a treacherous mountain trail. Dr. Holbrook stepped forward, his medical training overriding his surprise. "Dear God," he breathed, "they're exhibiting the same symptoms as our patients. How did they even manage to climb this far in their condition?" Samuel's transformation was immediate and startling. The withdrawn hermit disappeared, replaced by the physician he had once been. He stepped off the porch and strode through the snow toward the approaching children, his movement fluid and purposeful, his eyes already cataloging symptoms and assessing needs with the automatic precision of long experience. Joseph Crowfeather raised his hand in greeting, then stumbled slightly, caught by Dancing Moon before he could fall. When he straightened, his young face bore the weight of desperation that only a child forced into adult responsibilities could carry. "Are you the silent healer?" he asked, his voice carrying clearly in the thin air. "The one who understands sickness that other doctors cannot touch?" Samuel stopped a few feet away, his grey eyes moving from child to child, taking in details that Dr. Holbrook had missed in his initial assessment. These children were further along in the progression of whatever disease had claimed them. Their skin had the particular pallor that spoke of systems beginning to shut down. Their movements carried the careful deliberation of those conserving strength they could not spare. "We heard stories," Dancing Moon said, her voice musical despite the rasp of fever. "Our grandmother's grandmother spoke of white medicine men who could see into the spirit sickness, who understood that some illnesses come not from the body, but from places where the world grows thin." Samuel's hands trembled slightly, not from cold, but from the sudden rush of purpose that had been absent from his life for 3 years. He knelt in the snow before Joseph Crowfeather, his movement slow and non-threatening, his eyes level with the boy's fevered gaze. "What brings you so far from your people, young chief?" "The sickness came to our village 5 suns ago," Joseph replied, switching unconsciously between English and fragments of Kiowa that carried meanings too complex for translation. "9 of us fell ill, but the adults—" He paused, his jaw tightening, with the effort of controlling emotions too large for his young frame. "The adults are afraid. They say this sickness comes from the white world, that white medicine might be the only thing that can stop it." Dancing Moon unwrapped the buffalo hide bundle she had carried up the mountain, revealing items that made Samuel's breath catch in his throat. Dried herbs he recognized from his early studies, roots and bark that frontier doctors had learned to use from native healers, and nestled among them a small leather pouch that emanated the sharp, clean scent of medicines prepared, according to traditions far older than any medical school. "Our healer, Grandmother Willow Song, sent these," Dancing Moon explained. "She said the white doctor who lives like a ghost in the high places might understand their meaning. She said sometimes healing requires both the old knowledge and the new, the spirit medicine and the hand medicine working together." Samuel lifted one of the herb bundles, bringing it close to his nose. The scent triggered memories from his early days as a frontier physician, when he had learned that effective healing often required blending scientific knowledge with wisdom, gathered from unexpected sources. His own medical education had been supplemented by lessons from Doc Morrison, an old army surgeon who had spent years treating soldiers and civilians on the frontier. and had learned to respect the medical knowledge of native tribes. "Your grandmother is wise," Samuel said softly, still kneeling in the snow before the children, "but I haven't practiced medicine in 3 years. My hands—" He held them up, studying fingers that had once moved with surgical precision, but now bore only the calluses of manual labor. "I'm not sure I remember how to heal anyone." Little Wolf, despite being only 8 years old, stepped forward with the fearless honesty that belongs uniquely to children. "Our people are dying, sir. The white doctor in the town tried to help, but his medicine doesn't work. Grandmother Willow. Song says some sickness needs a healer who has walked in the Shadow Valley, who understands death so well that life becomes precious again." The words struck Samuel like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they carried a truth he had been running from for 3 years. Behind him, Pastor Williams, Sheriff Bradley, Mayor Cartwright, and Dr. Holbrook watched in stunned silence as the mountain hermit they had come to beg for help found himself faced with an even more desperate plea from children who had risked everything to reach him. Samuel rose slowly, snow falling from his knees, his decision forming with the inexorable certainty of sunrise after the longest night. "Then you're all mine to heal," he said, the words emerging from somewhere deeper than conscious thought, carrying the weight of an oath renewed and a purpose rediscovered. Samuel's cabin, which had seemed impossibly small from the outside, revealed itself to be a marvel of frontier efficiency once the children were brought inside. What had served as a hermit's solitary refuge transformed into an emergency field hospital through the simple expedient of rearranging furniture and lighting every available lamp and candle. The main room held a stone fireplace that Samuel quickly stoked to blazing heat, driving back the mountain cold that had seeped into the children's bones during their arduous climb. He cleared his rough-hewn table and covered it with clean blankets, creating an examination surface, while Pastor Williams and Sheriff Bradley moved Samuel's few chairs and his sleeping cot to form makeshift beds around the room's perimeter. Dr. Holbrook found himself relegated to the role of assistant, a position that would have wounded his pride under different circumstances, but now felt like blessed relief. He watched with growing amazement as Samuel shed 3 years of isolation, like a snake discarding old skin, his movements becoming fluid and purposeful, his hands regaining the steady confidence that had once made him legendary throughout the territory. "Joseph, you're the strongest," Samuel said to the eldest Kiowa boy, his voice carrying the natural authority of a physician taking charge of a crisis. "I need you to help me move your friends. Dancing Moon, can you tend the fire? Keep it burning hot? We need this room warmer than summer." The children obeyed without question, their fevered faces brightening with the first hope they had felt since the sickness claimed them. Even in their weakened state, they seemed to recognize something in Samuel's demeanor that transcended his 3 years of self-imposed silence, the unmistakable presence of a true healer, someone who understood suffering from the inside out. Samuel opened his medical bag for the first time since Elizabeth's funeral, his fingers finding familiar instruments with the muscle memory of countless examinations. The stethoscope felt foreign in his hands at first, its weight unfamiliar after so long unused, but as he placed it against Joseph Crowfeather's chest, the old rhythms returned like water finding its natural course. The boy's heartbeat was rapid and irregular, the sound distorted by what Samuel immediately recognized as fluid accumulation around the lungs. But beneath that obvious symptom lay something else, a pattern in the rhythm that didn't match any textbook description he had memorized during his medical training. It was as though the disease was attacking not just the body's systems, but something deeper, more fundamental. "Dr. Holbrook," Samuel said without looking up from his examination, "what treatments have you attempted with the children in town?" Holbrook recited his interventions like a student presenting to a professor: quinine for the fever, laudanum for the tremors, various tonics and poultices recommended by his medical texts. Each treatment had been applied according to proper protocol, documented with the precision that modern medicine demanded, yet none had produced even marginal improvement. Samuel nodded thoughtfully, his hands moving to check the lymph nodes in Joseph's neck. And the pattern of onset? Did the sickness appear randomly, or was there some common factor among the afflicted? That's what's so puzzling, Holbrook admitted. No common source of infection that I can identify. The children come from different families, different neighborhoods. Some had contact with each other, others didn't. It defies conventional epidemiology. As Samuel continued his examination, Dancing Moon approached with the bundle of traditional medicines her grandmother had sent. She unwrapped each item carefully, explaining its properties in the mixed English and Kiowa that marked her as someone straddling two worlds. Grandmother Willow's song says this sickness has come before, long ago, when her grandmother's grandmother was young. She calls it the soul fever, a sickness that touches not just the body, but the place where the spirit lives. Samuel's hands stilled on his stethoscope. Soul fever. The term resonated with something deep in his medical intuition, a recognition that went beyond formal training to touch the kind of understanding that comes only from years of witnessing. The mysterious connections between mind, body, and spirit. He had seen cases before, rare ones, where conventional medicine failed because the illness originated in territories that anatomy textbooks couldn't map. "Tell me about your grandmother's treatments," he said to Dancing Moon, his voice gentle but intent. "What did her people do when this sickness came before?" Dancing Moon's young face grew solemn as she recounted the stories that had been passed down through generations of Kiowa healers. They would take the sick ones to high places, away from the everyday world. They would use medicines that work, on both the body and the spirit. White sage to cleanse bad influences, sweet grass to call good spirits, cedar to protect against harmful energies. But most important was the healing ceremony, where the medicine person would take the sickness into themselves and give it back to the earth. Dr. Holbrook shifted uncomfortably, his scientific training recoiling from what sounded like primitive superstition. Yet as he watched Samuel's face, he saw not dismissal, but deep consideration, as though the older doctor were weighing the traditional remedies against his own accumulated knowledge. "The altitude," Samuel murmured, more to himself than to his audience. "High places, thin air, reduced atmospheric pressure. There could be physiological benefits." He trailed off, his mind working through possibilities that bridged the gap between Western medicine and indigenous wisdom. Mayor Cartwright, who had remained silent during the medical discussion, finally found his voice. "Dr. Thornfield, with all due respect, we didn't climb this mountain to watch you experiment with Indian remedies. These children need real medicine, not—" He gestured vaguely at the herbs and roots spread across Samuel's table. Samuel's grey eyes fixed on the mayor, with the intensity that made the politician step backward involuntarily. "Mr. Cartwright, in my 20 years of practicing medicine, I've learned that healing comes from many sources. The Kiowa people have survived on this continent for centuries, developing medical knowledge through trial and error just as rigorous as any university training. To dismiss their wisdom would be not just arrogant but potentially fatal for these children." He turned back to Dancing Moon, his expression softening. "Your grandmother sent specific medicines. Does she have instructions for how they should be used?" Dancing Moon nodded eagerly, reaching into her bundle to withdraw a piece of bark covered with symbols that meant nothing to the white men but carried precise meaning for those trained to read them. She drew the ceremony, showed how to prepare each medicine, how to combine them with the white doctor's knowledge. She said the silent healer would understand, because he has walked in the place where spirits and bodies meet. Samuel studied the bark with the same intensity he had once applied to medical journals, his finger tracing symbols that seemed to pulse with meaning just beyond his comprehension. Yet somewhere in his intuition, Connections were forming. Links between the traditional remedies and the pharmaceutical knowledge stored in his memory, bridges between indigenous healing practices and the scientific method that had guided his career. Young Thomas Singingbird, who had remained quiet during the adult conversation, suddenly began to convulse on his makeshift bed near the fireplace. His small body arched backward, his eyes rolling up until only the whites showed, his breath coming in short, desperate gasps that sounded like the cries of a wounded animal. Samuel was beside him instantly, his hands moving with the automatic precision of muscle memory as he supported the boy's head and checked his airway. "He's having a seizure," he called to Dr. Holbrook. "We need to prevent him from injuring himself, but don't try to restrain the convulsions. That could make them worse." For several terrifying minutes, Thomas's body fought against invisible demons while the adults watched helplessly. Samuel's hands remained steady on the boy's head, his voice calm and reassuring as he spoke words that were as much prayer as medical instruction. "Easy, son. Let it pass through you. Don't fight it, just let it move." Gradually, the convulsions subsided, leaving Thomas limp and exhausted, but breathing normally. Samuel checked his pulse and found it weak but steady, then covered him with an additional blanket to combat the shock that typically followed such episodes. "I've seen 3 similar seizures in the town children," Dr. Holbrook said quietly, his professional mask slipping to reveal genuine fear. "They're becoming more frequent, more severe. I'm afraid that if we can't find an effective treatment soon—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone in the cabin understood the implications. Without intervention, the seizures would eventually prove fatal, either through direct neurological damage or by exhausting the children's already weakened systems beyond their ability to recover. Samuel examined each of the 9 Kiowa children with the thoroughness of a man who had learned that details others might overlook often held the keys to successful treatment. Little Wolf's fever followed the same irregular pattern as the others, but his tremors seemed localized to his left side, suggesting possible neurological asymmetry. Sarah Windwalker's breathing was more labored than her companions, indicating fluid accumulation that required immediate attention. Each child presented a slightly different manifestation of the same underlying condition, like variations on a theme that remained frustratingly elusive. Samuel's training told him to look for the common factor, the underlying cause that expressed itself through these varied symptoms. But his growing intuition suggested that this particular illness might not yield to conventional diagnostic approaches. As evening approached and snow began falling more heavily outside the cabin windows, Samuel found himself standing at the crossroads of everything he had been and everything he might become. The familiar weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders like an old coat. The knowledge that other lives depended on his decisions, his skills, his willingness to risk failure in pursuit of healing. Dancing Moon approached him as he stood contemplating the traditional medicines spread across his table. "The silent healer looks troubled," she observed with a directness that marked her as someone unafraid of difficult truths. "Does he doubt the old ways?" Samuel looked down at her fever-bright eyes, seeing in them the same trust that had once made him feel worthy of the title doctor. "I don't doubt the old ways, Dancing Moon. I doubt myself. It's been 3 years since I tried to heal anyone, 3 years since I failed." He stopped, unable to voice the memories that still cut like fresh wounds. "Failure is not the end of healing," Dancing Moon said, her young voice carrying wisdom that seemed borrowed from her grandmother's long experience. Grandmother Willow. Song says that sometimes a healer must break before they can truly understand what it means to put broken things back together. She says the silent healer's heart was broken so he could learn to heal hearts that are breaking. Pastor Williams. overheard the exchange and felt his own heart constrict with recognition. How many times had he offered similar words to grieving parishioners, speaking of God's plan and the mysterious ways that suffering could lead to greater compassion? Yet hearing such wisdom from a fevered child seemed to carry weight that his practiced sermons had never achieved. The first night in the cabin passed without sleep for any of the adults. Samuel worked by lamplight, combining his medical knowledge with the traditional remedies Dancing Moon's grandmother had provided. He prepared tinctures and teas according to recipes that bridged centuries of healing tradition, his movements guided by instincts that seemed to awaken from long dormancy. Dr. Holbrook watched with fascination as Samuel worked, noting techniques and approaches that no medical school had ever taught. The older doctor's hands moved with a rhythm that was part science, part art, part something indefinable that could only be learned through years of intimate acquaintance with human suffering. "You're combining the willow bark with something I don't recognize," Holbrook observed, leaning closer to watch Samuel's preparations. "What is it?" "White sage and a root the Kiowa call spirit medicine," Samuel replied, his voice steady with returning confidence. "The willow bark contains salicin, what modern chemists are calling acetyl salicylic acid. It reduces fever and inflammation, but the traditional medicines work on aspects of illness that our Western training doesn't acknowledge." As the 9 children slept fitfully around the cabin's warm interior, Samuel began to see patterns that his 3 years of isolation had prepared him to recognize. This was not simply a physical disease, but something that attacked the connection between body and spirit, leaving its victims adrift in a liminal space where conventional medicine could not reach. The night wore on, marked by the whisper of wind through pine trees and the soft murmur of Samuel's voice as he began for the first time in 3 years to speak words of healing over those who needed them most. The pre-dawn hours brought no rest to the mountain cabin. Samuel moved through the shadowed room like a spirit himself, checking each child's breathing, feeling for fever changes, administering doses of the combined medicines he had prepared through the night. His movements carried the fluid grace of a man who had found his purpose again, yet his eyes held the weight of knowing that every decision could mean the difference between life and death. Little Wolf had taken a turn for the worse near midnight, his small body racked with convulsions that seemed to come in waves, each one more violent than the last. Samuel knelt beside the boy's makeshift bed, his hand steady on the child's burning forehead, speaking in low, soothing tones that seemed to reach through the fever's grip to touch something deeper. "The spirit sickness is fighting back," Dancing Moon whispered from her own bed, where she lay propped against rolled blankets, her dark eyes alert despite her obvious exhaustion. Grandmother Willow's song warned this would happen. She said, "When you try to heal soul fever, the sickness becomes angry, tries to take the children completely before they can be saved." Dr. Holbrook, who had been taking notes on Samuel's unconventional treatments, looked up sharply. "That's medically impossible. Diseases don't become angry. They follow biological patterns, respond to pharmaceutical interventions according to predictable mechanisms." Samuel's grey eyes met the younger doctor's gaze across Little Wolf's trembling form. "Marcus, in 3 years of isolation, I've had time to think about the limitations of what we learned in medical school. We were taught to treat symptoms, to categorize illnesses according to observable physical manifestations. But what if some conditions originate in territories that our instruments can't measure?" He gestured toward the window, where the first pale light of dawn was beginning to illuminate the snow-covered peaks surrounding them. "These mountains have been home to indigenous peoples for thousands of years. They've developed medical knowledge through generations of trial and error, observation and experimentation. Their understanding of the connection between physical and spiritual health might be more sophisticated than our modern assumptions allow. Pastor Williams, who had spent the night in prayer and contemplation, found himself nodding slowly. "I've counseled enough dying people to know that some healing requires more than medicine. Sometimes the soul needs tending before the body can recover." The conversation was interrupted by a soft moan from Sarah Windwalker, the 9-year-old who had shown signs of the healing gift that ran in her family's bloodline. She sat up slowly, her movements careful and deliberate, her young face bearing an expression of concentration that seemed far too mature for her years. "The medicine is working," she announced with quiet certainty, "but not the way the white doctor expects. It's not fighting the sickness, it's teaching our bodies to remember how to be well." Samuel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain cold. The child's words echoed theories he had been developing during his years of isolation, ideas about the body's natural healing mechanisms that went beyond the mechanical model he had been taught to follow. "Sarah, can you feel the medicine working inside you?" She nodded, her small hands pressed against her chest where Samuel knew her heart was still beating too rapidly. "It feels like when you're lost in the dark and someone lights a candle far away. You can't see the path yet, but you know which direction to walk." Dr. Holbrook set down his pen, his note-taking abandoned in favor of simply observing what was unfolding before him. His medical training had prepared him to dismiss such descriptions as fever-induced delirium, but the child's clarity of expression and the obvious improvement in her breathing suggested something more complex was occurring. Samuel began preparing. The morning dose of combined medicines, his movements now incorporating elements of the traditional ceremony that Dancing Moon had described. He burned dried sage in a small clay bowl, letting the smoke rise through the cabin air, not from superstition, but from growing understanding that healing often required engaging multiple senses, creating an environment where the body's natural recovery mechanisms could function optimally. "The aromatic compounds in sage have antimicrobial properties," he explained to Dr. Holbrook, who was watching with barely concealed skepticism. "But beyond that, scent affects the limbic system, influences stress hormones, can actually trigger physiological changes that support immune function. Indigenous healers understood these connections long before we had names for the biological mechanisms involved." As the morning progressed, Samuel noticed subtle but unmistakable improvements in several of the children. Joseph Crowfeather's breathing became less labored, the irregular patterns smoothing into something approaching normal rhythm. Dancing Moon's fever began to break, sweat beading on her forehead as her body finally began winning its battle against the mysterious infection. But the most dramatic change occurred in Thomas Singing Bird, the cheerful boy whose seizure the previous day had been the most severe Samuel had witnessed. As the sun climbed higher, casting golden light through the cabin's frost-covered windows, Thomas opened his eyes for the first time in 2 days and spoke with perfect clarity. "I dreamed about your family," he said to Samuel, his young voice carrying weight that seemed impossible for someone barely 10 years old. The lady with brown hair and the little girl with pigtails. They were standing in a garden where all the flowers bloomed at once, and they said to tell you that healing others doesn't dishonor their memory. It honors what they taught you about love. The cabin fell into absolute silence. Sheriff Bradley stopped adjusting the fire. Pastor Williams ceased his quiet prayers. Dr. Holbrook's pen froze above his notebook. Samuel felt as though the world had tilted on its axis, leaving him struggling to find his balance in a reality that had suddenly become larger and stranger than anything his medical training had prepared him to navigate. "You couldn't have known about them," Samuel whispered, his voice barely audible above the crackling of logs in the fireplace. "No one here would have told you." Thomas smiled with the serene wisdom that sometimes appears in children who have traveled to the edges of life, and returned with messages from territories that adults cannot visit. In the spirit place there are no strangers. Your wife Elizabeth says the medicine you're making tastes like the tea she used to brew for sick neighbors. Your daughter Emma says she's proud that her papa remembered how to fix broken things. Samuel's hands trembled as he reached for the edge of the table, his legs suddenly unsteady beneath him. For 3 years he had carried the weight of unspoken conversations, words he had never been able to say to the family he had lost. The possibility that those words might somehow have been heard, that love could transcend the boundaries of life and death, shook the foundations of his carefully constructed isolation. Dr. Holbrook, despite his scientific skepticism, found himself studying Thomas' singing bird with new attention. The boy's previous medical records, temperature, pulse, respiratory rate, had all indicated severe systemic distress, yet now his vital signs were normalizing with a speed that defied medical explanation. Whatever had occurred during his fevered sleep had produced physiological changes that conventional medicine could neither predict nor explain. "I need to examine him again," Holbrook said, reaching for his stethoscope with hands that weren't entirely steady. As he listened to Thomas's heart, his expression gradually shifted from skepticism to wonder. The irregular rhythms that had characterized the boy's condition were smoothing into normal patterns. The fluid accumulation around his lungs was clearly diminishing, and his skin temperature had dropped significantly. "This is impossible," Holbrook murmured, checking and rechecking his findings. "The rate of improvement violates everything I understand about infectious disease progression. Patients don't recover this quickly from neurological fevers. The healing process should take weeks, not hours." Samuel was examining the other children, noting similar improvements in several cases, while others remained critically ill. A pattern was emerging, though not one that medical textbooks would have predicted. The children who were responding most dramatically to treatment were those who seemed most open to the spiritual aspects of the healing process. Those who spoke of dreams and visions, who described feeling the medicine working from the inside out. Dancing Moon sat up carefully, testing her returning strength like someone learning to walk again after a long illness. Grandmother Willowsong said this would happen. She said the soul fever can only be healed when the medicine person stops fighting against the mystery and starts working with it. "Working with what mystery?" Dr. Holbrook demanded, his scientific training rebelling against explanations that couldn't be measured or quantified. "We're dealing with biological systems here, not supernatural phenomena. There has to be a rational explanation for what's occurring." Samuel paused in his examination of young Mary Stones the Crow, a 7-year-old whose condition had remained unchanged despite the treatments that were clearly helping her companions. "Marcus, what if the rational explanation is that healing involves factors our medical training never taught us to consider? What if consciousness, belief, spiritual connection, what if these aren't separate from biology but fundamental aspects of how living systems actually function?" He gestured toward Thomas Singingbird, who was now sitting up and sipping water with obvious relish. "This boy was dying 12 hours ago. His neurological function was severely compromised, his immune system was failing, his prognosis was terminal, according to every medical indicator we could measure. Yet here he sits, not just stable, but actively recovering. Something happened that our instruments can't detect, but our eyes can clearly observe. The morning brought an unexpected visitor. A lone figure on horseback appeared on the trail below the cabin, riding hard despite the treacherous conditions. As the rider drew closer, Sheriff Bradley recognized Jake Morrison from the livery stable, his face grim with news that had driven him to risk the dangerous mountain journey. Morrison burst through the cabin door without ceremony, snow cascading from his coat and hat. "Sheriff, you need to know. 3 more children fell sick in town since you left. The Williams twins and little Rebecca Stone. Dr. Holbrook's assistant has been treating them, but he glanced around the cabin, taking in the scene of sick native American children being tended by the legendary hermit doctor. Hell, looks like the sickness found you up here too. These children climbed the mountain seeking help, Samuel explained, not pausing in his preparation of medicines. They're responding to treatment, but we need to understand how to apply what we're learning to the children in town. Morrison's weathered face creased with worry. That might not be possible, Doc. Town's in an uproar about you coming down from your mountain. Some folks are saying the Indian children brought the sickness with them, that it's spreading because of mixing white and native medicines. Dixon Wheeler's been stirring up trouble, claiming you've lost your mind up here, talking to spirits and such. Samuel's hands stilled on the medicine bottles. Dixon Wheeler had been a problem even before Samuel's exile, a mine foreman who used his position to bully workers and spread discord throughout the community. If Wheeler was actively opposing Samuel's return to medical practice, the political complications could prove as dangerous as the medical crisis itself. There's more, Morrison continued reluctantly. Wheeler's got some of the town council convinced that bringing you down to treat the sick children would be like inviting a madman to experiment on their babies. He's calling for the territorial authorities to intervene, maybe even bring in army doctors from Fort Carson. Mayor Cartwright's face paled at this news. Military intervention would mean admitting that the civilian authorities couldn't handle the crisis, a failure that would end his political career and possibly result in martial law being imposed on Medicine Creek Township. How much time do we have before Wheeler's opposition becomes official action? Maybe 2 days, Morrison replied, grimly. 3 at the outside, and that's only if the children in town don't get worse. If we start losing young ones. He left the implication unspoken. Samuel looked around the cabin at the 9 Kiowa children, some clearly improving while others remained critically ill, then at the faces of the white men who had climbed the mountain seeking salvation and found themselves in the middle of a crisis that threatened to tear their community apart. The weight of decision settled on his shoulders like a familiar burden. He could remain on his mountain, continue treating the 9 children who had sought him out and let the town face its crisis without him, or he could descend back into the world he had fled, risk exposing himself to the memories that had driven him to exile, and attempt to heal not just the sick children, but the fears and prejudices that were spreading through Medicine Creek Township. Like a different kind of infection, young Joseph Crowfeather, who had been listening to the adult conversation with the intense focus that marked him as a future leader, spoke into the tense silence. The silent healer must choose, he said simply. Stay safe on the mountain, or risk everything to save all the children, ours and yours together. Samuel's grey eyes met the boy's fevered gaze, and in that moment he saw reflected back not just his own choice, but the kind of courage that transcends fear, the willingness to step forward into uncertainty, because remaining still means abandoning others to their suffering. The wind outside grew stronger, shaking the cabin's walls and sending snow spiraling past the windows like spirits dancing in the morning light. Inside, the fire crackled with renewed life, casting warm shadows that seemed to embrace both the healing and the healed, the doctors and the patients, the past and the uncertain future that was even now taking shape in the meeting of old wisdom and new understanding. Samuel's decision came at the moment when dawn broke fully over Whispering Ridge, casting long shadows across snow that sparkled like crushed diamonds. He stood at his cabin window, watching the sun paint the valley below in shades of gold and rose, knowing that somewhere in that peaceful-looking township, children were dying while adults argued about pride and protocol. "I'm going down," he announced, his voice cutting through the quiet morning air with the finality of an avalanche. "Jake, how many horses did you bring?" Morrison shook his head grimly. "Just the one, Doc. Didn't expect to be hauling a whole medical expedition back down the mountain. We'll need to send someone ahead to bring more animals, or... He glanced at the 9 Kiowa children, some now sitting up and taking nourishment, others still locked in fevered sleep. The children who are improving can ride double, Samuel decided, his mind already working through logistics with the precision that had once made him famous for handling medical emergencies. Dancing Moon. Joseph, Thomas, you're strong enough to travel. The others need to stay here until they're stable enough for the journey. Dancing Moon stood carefully, testing her legs like a foal learning to walk. Her fever had broken completely during the night, leaving her weak but clear-headed, her dark eyes bright with returning health. Who will care for the ones who stay? Behind? Samuel paused in his packing, realizing he was about to face a choice that went to the heart of medical ethics. Leave some children under the care of untrained adults while he descended to treat others, or remain on the mountain while more children in town potentially died waiting for help that never came. Dr. Holbrook solved the dilemma with words that surprised everyone in the cabin, including himself. "I'll stay," he said quietly, setting down his notebook with hands that barely trembled. "I've watched you work through the night, Samuel. I think I understand the principles behind your combined approach, at least well enough to continue the treatments until you can return." Sheriff Bradley studied the younger doctor's face, noting the transformation that had occurred over the past 24 hours. The arrogant confidence that had marked Dr. Holbrook's early years in Medicine Creek Township had been replaced by something deeper, humility earned through witnessing the limits of his own knowledge, respect born from watching a master healer at work. "Marcus, are you certain?" Samuel asked, using the man's first name for the first time since they'd met. "These children will be depending on you to maintain dosages, monitor their conditions, recognize warning signs that might require immediate intervention." "I'm certain," Holbrook replied, his voice gaining strength. "I became a doctor to help people, not to protect my own reputation. If staying here means learning techniques that could save more lives in the future, then this is where I need to be." The descent began under a sky that threatened snow, the small party moving carefully down the treacherous trail that had challenged them during their ascent. Samuel rode in front, his mountain-bred horse sure-footed on the icy path, his medical bag secured behind his saddle like a knight's shield carried into battle. Behind him, Dancing Moon rode with Pastor Williams, her small frame bundled in blankets, but her eyes alert as she watched the landscape change from high alpine terrain to the mixed forests of the lower elevations. Joseph Crowfeather shared Sheriff Bradley's mount, his young face set with the determination of someone carrying responsibility beyond his years. Thomas Singing Bird, despite his miraculous recovery, rode with Mayor Cartwright, who found himself unexpectedly moved by the boy's cheerful observations about the journey. "Look how the trees change their clothes as we go down the mountain," Thomas said, pointing to aspens whose golden leaves still clung to their branches despite the season. "Up high, everything is sleeping for winter. Down low, some things are still trying to stay awake." The words struck Cartwright as a surprisingly apt metaphor for what they were attempting, bringing life from the sleeping heights down to the dying valley, bridging the gap between worlds that had existed separately. For too long, as they descended, Samuel found his memories returning like water flowing downhill toward familiar channels. Every bend in the trail brought recollections of his previous life, hunting trips with his father-in-law, romantic rides with Elizabeth during their courtship, fishing expeditions where Emma had squealed with delight at landing her first trout. The pain of these memories was still sharp, but it no longer felt like a blade cutting through his chest. Instead, it carried the bittersweet ache of love remembered rather than love lost, connection that transcended physical presence. Thomas Singing Bird's dream message had planted a seed of possibility, that healing others might indeed honor, rather than betray the family he had been unable to save. The first sign of trouble came when they reached the abandoned mining camp where they had stopped during their ascent. Fresh tracks in the snow marked the passage of multiple riders, hoofprints that led both up towards Samuel's cabin and back, down toward town. The tracks were recent, made within the past few hours, and their pattern suggested urgency rather than casual travel. Sheriff Bradley dismounted to examine the trail more closely, his tracker's eye reading the story written in churned snow and broken ice. At least 6 riders, maybe more, moving fast, pushing their horses harder than the conditions warrant. He looked up at Samuel with concern. "Someone's been up here looking for us." Mayor Cartwright's political instincts immediately grasped the implications. "Wheeler's people. He must have sent scouts to see if we actually made contact with you, Samuel, if he knows you're coming down to treat the children." The mayor didn't need to finish the thought. Everyone understood that Dixon Wheeler's opposition would intensify dramatically once he learned that the mad hermit doctor was returning to practice medicine in Medicine Creek Township. Wheeler had built his influence by appealing to fear and prejudice, and Samuel's collaboration with Native American healers would provide exactly the kind of ammunition Wheeler needed to turn the entire community against any attempt at treatment. They pressed on down the mountain, the mood growing more tense as they approached the tree line, where the valley spread out before them like a map of their old lives. Samuel could see the white church spire, the red schoolhouse roof, the neat grid of streets that had once been as familiar as his own heartbeat. Smoke rose from chimneys in the still air, suggesting normalcy, but his experienced eye noted details that others might miss. Too much smoke from the direction of the cemetery, indicating the blacksmith was working overtime on something, possibly coffins. Dancing moon pointed toward the eastern edge of the valley, where a cluster of teepees and modest cabins marked the location of the Kiowa settlement. "Our people will be watching for us," she said. "Grandmother Willow's song will want to know if the silent healer found his medicine again." Samuel nodded, understanding that his success or failure would affect not just individual children, but the delicate relationship between two communities that had learned to coexist through careful respect for boundaries. If the healing failed, if politics and prejudice prevented him from treating all the affected children, the consequences could shatter the fragile peace that had taken years to establish. As they reached the valley floor, a rider approached at a gallop, his horse lathered with sweat despite the cold. Samuel recognized Dr. James Wheeler, Dixon's younger brother, who had recently returned from medical school in Philadelphia with modern ideas about sanitation and disease control. "Stop right there," James Wheeler called, his voice cracking with the authority of youth trying to command respect it hadn't earned. "By order of the Emergency Health Committee, no one is permitted to enter Medicine Creek Township without proper medical clearance. There are reports of infectious disease, and bringing these," he gestured toward the Kiowa children, "these potential carriers into contact with our population could trigger a full epidemic." Sheriff Bradley's horse danced sideways, sensing its rider's tension. "Dr. Wheeler, we're returning from a medical consultation requested by the town council. These children have been receiving treatment, and their conditions are improving. There's no legal authority for the kind of quarantine you're suggesting." "There is now," James Wheeler replied, pulling a folded document from his coat. "Emergency powers granted by the Territorial Health Authority. Any person showing symptoms of infectious disease can be detained for examination and treatment by certified medical personnel." Samuel studied the young doctor's face, seeing in it the same combination of fear and arrogance that had characterized his brother Dixon for years. James Wheeler's medical degree might be more recent than Samuel's own training, but his understanding of frontier conditions was clearly limited by classroom theories that bore little resemblance to the complex realities of treating actual patients. "Dr. Wheeler," Samuel said calmly, I've been treating these children for the past day and night. Their conditions are improving under a combined therapeutic approach that has shown remarkable success. To interrupt their treatment now could prove a fatal combined approach. James Wheeler's eyebrows rose with the skepticism of someone who had never encountered medical practices outside the narrow confines of institutional learning. Are you referring to some form of experimental treatment? I'll need to see your documentation, your protocol approvals, your safety assessments before any patients can be moved. Dancing Moon, despite her youth and recent illness, possessed the diplomatic skills that marked her as the granddaughter of leaders. "Dr. Wheeler," she said respectfully, "we are not carriers of sickness, but children who sought healing and found it. Would you deny us the right to return to our families healthy?" But James Wheeler's response revealed the depth of prejudice that his medical education had failed to address. "Young lady, I appreciate your perspective, but medical decisions must be made by qualified professionals based on scientific evidence, not folk remedies and primitive ceremonies. The fact that you feel better doesn't mean you're not still infectious." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, 4 men and 3 children facing a single young doctor whose authority rested on papers rather than experience, whose knowledge came from books rather than the accumulated wisdom of treating actual patients under frontier conditions. Samuel felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders, but this time it carried a different quality. He was no longer the broken hermit fleeing from failure, nor was he the confident young physician he had been before tragedy taught him humility. He was something new, a healer who had learned to work with mystery rather than against it, who understood that medicine could be both art and science, both individual treatment and community healing. The wind picked up, swirling snow around the horses' legs and sending ice crystals dancing through the air like tiny spirits celebrating the moment when everything would change. Samuel looked once more toward the town where children lay dying, then at the young doctor whose fear and prejudice stood between healing and tragedy. "Dr. Wheeler," he said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of hard-won wisdom, "I'm going to treat every sick child in this valley, regardless of their race or the politics surrounding their illness. You can help me or you can stand aside, but you will not prevent me from honoring the oath I took when I became a physician." The challenge hung in the winter air like a gauntlet thrown down before assembled armies, and everyone present understood that the next few moments would determine whether healing would triumph over fear, or whether prejudice would claim more victims than any disease ever could. The confrontation with Dr. James Wheeler dissolved into an uneasy standoff when a new rider appeared on the horizon, galloping hard across the snow-covered valley floor. Even from a distance, Sheriff Bradley recognized the distinctive figure of Martha Wessington's grandson, Timothy Chen, whose desperate urgency was evident in the way he drove his horse through drifts that should have slowed any sensible rider to a careful walk. Timothy reached them with his horse's flanks heaving, the animal's breath creating clouds of steam in the frigid air. His usually cheerful face was etched with panic as he struggled to catch his breath enough to speak. "Sheriff Bradley, Dr. Thornfield, you have to come now. Rebecca Stone died an hour ago. Just stopped breathing in her sleep. Her mother hasn't stopped screaming." The words hit the assembled group like a physical blow. Rebecca Stone had been only 4 years old, the youngest of Dixon Wheeler's nieces, a bright-eyed child who had charmed everyone in Medicine Creek Township with a habit of offering wildflowers to strangers and singing made-up songs while her mother worked in their family garden. Dr. James Wheeler's face went ashen, his earlier bluster evaporating like morning mist. "Rebecca's dead." His voice cracked on the words, but Uncle Dixon said she was responding to treatment, that Dr. Holbrook's assistant had her condition stabilized. "That's not all," Timothy continued, his words tumbling out in a desperate rush. Billy Patterson's getting worse, started having seizures that won't stop. The Williams twins are unconscious. Mrs. Patterson's threatening to take a shotgun to anyone who tries to prevent Dr. Thornfield from treating her boy. The whole town's gone crazy with fear. Samuel felt the familiar weight of medical emergency settling on his shoulders, the adrenaline response that had carried him through countless crises during his years of active practice. But this time, the weight carried additional burden, the knowledge that his 3-year absence had allowed preventable deaths to occur, that his self-imposed exile had cost lives he might have saved. "James," he said to the younger Wheeler, his voice gentle but implacable, "your quarantine order just became irrelevant. Children are dying while we argue about procedures. I'm going to treat every sick child in this valley starting now. You can arrest me afterward if your conscience demands it, but first let me try to save lives that your protocols are failing to protect." The ride into Medicine Creek Township became a procession that gathered witnesses and whispers with every block. They traveled. Word of Samuel's return spread faster than wildfire, bringing people to their windows and doorways despite the bitter cold. Some faces showed relief and hope. Parents whose children lay sick, neighbors who remembered Samuel's legendary healing touch, elders who had always believed he would return when the community needed him most. But other faces revealed fear and suspicion, expressions twisted by Dixon Wheeler's months of careful propaganda about the mad hermit doctor who had abandoned his responsibilities and lost his sanity in the mountains. These were the faces of people who had been taught to see Samuel's grief as weakness, his isolation as abandonment, his unconventional healing methods as dangerous experimentation. The largest crowd gathered outside the Patterson family's house, where Billy lay in the grip of seizures that had been racking his small body for hours. Margaret Patterson sat beside her son's bed, her eyes red from crying, her hands clutched in prayer so desperate it seemed to pull at the very air around her. When she looked up and saw Samuel standing in her doorway, her face transformed with hope so intense it was almost painful to witness. "Dr. Thornfield," she whispered, her voice breaking on his name, "please, he's all I have left. My husband died in the mine collapse last year, and he's everything. If you can save him." Samuel approached the bed with movements that were both confident and reverent, his hands already reading the boy's condition through touch that penetrated beyond surface symptoms to grasp the underlying patterns of the illness. Billy's seizures were different from what he had observed in the Kiowa children, more violent, more deeply entrenched, suggesting that the disease had progressed further in the absence of proper treatment. "Mrs. Patterson, I need you to gather every lamp and candle in the house," Samuel instructed, his voice calm despite the crisis unfolding before him. "Billy's condition is serious, but it's not hopeless. I'm going to try treatments that may seem unconventional. I need you to trust me." Outside the Patterson house, Dixon Wheeler was organizing opposition with the skill of a man who had spent years manipulating frontier politics to his advantage. He stood on an improvised platform, a wooden crate borrowed from the general store, addressing a crowd that had swelled to include nearly half the township's adult population. "Folks, we're facing a choice that will define our community for generations to come," Wheeler declared, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention. "Do we trust our children's lives to a man who abandoned us in our hour of need 3 years ago? A man who's been living like a savage in the mountains, talking to spirits, practicing God knows what kind of heathen medicine?" The crowd murmured, fear and uncertainty rippling through the assembled townspeople like wind through wheat. Wheeler had chosen his words carefully, playing on prejudices and anxieties that ran deep in a community that had always defined itself. In opposition to the other, whether that other was the wilderness, the Native American tribes, or anything that challenged their narrow definitions of civilization and proper behavior. "I've heard reports," Wheeler continued, his voice rising with evangelical fervor, "that Thornfield has been working with Indian medicine men, mixing Christian children's blood with heathen potions, conducting ceremonies that mock everything we hold sacred. Is this the kind of treatment we want for our babies?" Mrs. Eleanor Hawthorne, the banker's wife, whose moral pronouncements carried weight among the church auxiliary ladies, stepped forward to support Wheeler's position. "Dr. Wheeler speaks truth," she announced, her voice shrill with righteousness. "We've all heard the stories about what goes on in those Indian ceremonies, drum beating and chanting, calling on spirits that good Christians should never invoke. Would you risk your children's immortal souls for the promise of earthly healing?" But Wheeler's rhetoric met unexpected resistance from voices that had remained silent during previous community disputes. Old Martha Wessington hobbled forward, leaning heavily on her cane, but moving with the determination of someone who had outlived most of her contemporaries and feared no earthly authority. "Dixon Wheeler," she said, her voice carrying across the crowd with surprising strength, "you talk mighty big about protecting children, but where were you when Dr. Thornfield spent weeks treating the scarlet fever outbreak without charging a single family a penny? Where was your concern when he sat up all night with the Murphy baby, keeping that child breathing until the crisis passed?" Her words sparked a murmur of agreement from older residents who remembered Samuel's years of dedicated service. Jake Morrison stepped forward to add his voice to Martha's defense. "I've known Samuel Thornfield for 15 years. Never seen him turn away a patient. Never known him to let politics interfere with healing. If he says he can help these children, that's good enough for me." The crowd was beginning to divide along lines that had nothing to do with medical expertise and everything to do with fundamental beliefs about community, responsibility, and the nature of healing itself. Those who supported Samuel's return tended to be people who had personal experience with his medical skill, parents whose children he had treated, patients whose lives he had saved, neighbors who had witnessed his dedication during previous health crises. Those who opposed him were generally followers of Dixon Wheeler's political faction, people who had been taught to see cooperation with Native Americans as weakness, to view unconventional healing methods as threats to their religious beliefs, to interpret Samuel's grief-driven isolation as proof of mental instability. Inside the Patterson house, Samuel worked with focused intensity, applying the combined treatment protocols he had developed on the mountain while adapting them to Billy's more advanced condition. He had prepared tinctures using both traditional pharmacological compounds and the native medicines Dancing Moon had brought, creating preparations that engaged multiple biological systems simultaneously. Dancing Moon assisted with the confidence of someone who had been raised in healing traditions, her small hands steady as she helped Samuel measure dosages and monitor Billy's responses. Her presence in the sick room created additional controversy among the townspeople gathered outside, many of whom had never seen a Native American child inside a white family's home. "The boy's spirit is far away," Dancing Moon observed, her hand resting lightly on Billy's forehead as she checked his temperature with methods that required no thermometer. "He's lost in the fever dream place, and he doesn't know how to find his way back to his body." Samuel nodded, recognizing the accuracy of her assessment despite its unconventional terminology. Billy's neurological responses suggested a kind of dissociative state that went beyond simple unconsciousness. His mind seemed to have retreated to some protected space while his body fought the infection, leaving him suspended between wakefulness and whatever lay beyond. "In Kiowa healing, how do you guide a lost spirit back to the body?" Samuel asked, his question carrying genuine respect for knowledge that his medical training had never acknowledged. "Singing," Dancing Moon replied without hesitation. Songs that call the spirit by name, that remind it why the body is worth returning to. Grandmother Willow's song taught me the songs, but... She hesitated, glancing toward the window where voices from the street crowd could be heard growing louder and more agitated. But you're afraid the white people will misunderstand the ceremony, Samuel finished gently. Think it's something dangerous or evil, instead of a healing practice. Dancing Moon nodded, her young face troubled by the complexity of adult prejudices she was only beginning to understand. Our medicine and your medicine should work together, but some people want to keep them fighting instead. Outside, the confrontation between Dixon Wheeler's faction and Samuel's supporters was escalating towards something that could shatter the community permanently. Voices rose in anger. Accusations flew like arrows, and the careful social fabric that held Medicine Creek Township together began fraying at the edges. Sheriff Bradley found himself caught between his duty to maintain order and his growing conviction that Samuel represented the best hope for ending the medical crisis that was tearing the town apart. He stood on the Patterson family's front porch, his badge gleaming in the afternoon light, trying to project calm authority while the crowd below him seethed with emotions that threatened to explode into violence. "Folks," he called, his voice carrying the weight of 20 years of law enforcement experience, "we've got sick children who need medical attention, and we've got a qualified doctor willing to provide that attention. Everything else is politics, and politics can wait until after we've saved some lives." But Wheeler's response revealed the extent to which fear had poisoned rational discourse. "Qualified?" he shouted back. "A man who's been living like a hermit for 3 years, who claims to hear voices from the dead, who mixes Indian witch doctor ceremonies with Christian medicine. That's not qualification, that's madness dressed up as healing." The crowd's reactions split like lightning, some shouting agreement with Wheeler's inflammatory rhetoric, while others defended Samuel with equally passionate conviction. The division that had been simmering beneath Medicine Creek Township's surface for years suddenly erupted into open conflict, threatening to destroy the community just when unity was most desperately needed. Inside the Patterson house, Samuel felt the town's turmoil pressing against the windows like a storm seeking entry. But he also felt something else, the steady pulse of Billy Patterson's heartbeat under his stethoscope, stronger than it had been in days, responding to treatments that bridged worlds of knowledge previously kept separate by fear and misunderstanding. Chica. Boy's eyes fluttered open for the first time in 48 hours, focusing slowly on Samuel's face with the wondering expression of someone returning from a very long journey. "Dr. Thornfield," Billy whispered, his voice barely audible, but carrying perfect clarity. "I dreamed about your little girl. She said to tell you that helping other children makes her happy, not sad." Samuel's hands trembled as he checked Billy's pulse, his professional composure nearly shattered by words that seemed to carry messages from beyond the grave. Outside, the crowd's voices grew louder, angrier, more dangerous. But inside the small room where healing was occurring, despite all opposition, Samuel felt something he had not experienced in 3 years. The profound satisfaction of watching a child return from the edge of death, guided back to life by medicine that honored both science and spirit, both knowledge and wisdom, both the past and the possibility of redemption. The transformation of Billy Patterson from dying child to recovering patient sent shockwaves through the crowd gathered outside the Patterson house. Word spread with the speed that only genuine miracles achieve. The hermit doctor had done what the trained physician from Chicago could not. Within minutes, desperate parents were pushing through the crowd, some carrying children too weak to walk, others pleading for Samuel to visit bedsides where their own young ones lay trapped in fever dreams. But Dixon Wheeler recognized the threat that Samuel's success posed to his carefully constructed narrative of fear and opposition. As parents began defecting from his faction, drawn by hope stronger than prejudice, Wheeler made a decision that would forever mark him as a man willing to sacrifice children's lives for political power. "Stop!" Wheeler's voice cracked like a whip across the crowd. "Don't you see what's happening? This supposed miracle is exactly what we should fear most. The boy's recovery isn't natural. It's the result of unholy influences, spirits, and forces that no Christian community should invite within its borders." Margaret Patterson, who had just witnessed her son return from the edge of death, emerged from her house with Billy supported against her shoulder, his color returning, his eyes bright with returning health. The sight should have ended all argument, but Wheeler's next words revealed the depths of his desperation to maintain control. "Look at him," Wheeler declared, pointing an accusing finger at the recovering boy. "That's not healing. That's possession. The Indian witch doctors have put something unnatural into that child, something that will grow and spread and corrupt every soul it touches. Margaret Patterson, you've saved your son's body by damning his spirit." The accusation was so vicious, so calculated to exploit the deepest fears of a frontier community, raised on stories of spiritual warfare, that even some of Samuel's supporters stepped back in uncertainty. Margaret Patterson's face went white with shock, her arms tightening protectively around her son, as whispers rippled through the crowd. But Billy Patterson, despite his youth and recent illness, possessed the clear-eyed honesty that sometimes allows children to cut through adult complexity with devastating simplicity. He looked directly at Dixon Wheeler, his voice carrying clearly in the tense air. "Mr. Wheeler, I'm not possessed. I'm just not sick anymore. Dr. Thornfield made the fever go away, and Dancing Moon taught me songs that helped me find my way back from the scary place. Why are you angry that I'm not going to die?" The question hung in the air like a challenge that no adult present was prepared to answer honestly. How do you explain to a child that some grown-ups prefer to see children die rather than be healed by methods they don't approve of? How do you justify opposing a miracle because it threatens your political position? Samuel stepped out of the Patterson house, his medical bag in one hand, his grey eyes sweeping across the divided crowd with the steady gaze of a man who had found his purpose again. Behind him, Dancing Moon emerged carrying her grandmother's bundle of traditional medicines, her young chin raised with the dignity of someone representing ancient wisdom in the face of ignorant opposition. "I'm going to treat every sick child in this valley," Samuel announced, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had once made him beloved throughout the territory. "I'll start with the Williams twins, then move to whoever needs help next. You can help me, or you can stand aside, but you will not prevent me from saving lives." Dixon Wheeler's response revealed a man pushed beyond reason by the collapse of his carefully constructed power base. "Like hell you will," he snarled, pulling a pistol from his coat with shaking hands. "I won't let you corrupt our children with your devil worship and Indian magic. This community will remain pure, even if it means some die to protect the rest." The sight of an armed man threatening a doctor and a child sent a wave of shock through even Wheeler's supporters. Sheriff Bradley's hand moved to his own weapon, his voice sharp with command. "Dixon, put that gun down now. Threatening a doctor in the performance of his duties is a felony under territorial law." But Wheeler had moved beyond caring about legal consequences. His face was flushed with the fever of fanaticism, his eyes wild with the desperation of a man watching his worldview collapse around him. "You don't understand, any of you. This isn't about medicine. It's about the survival of everything we've built here. These people," he gestured wildly toward Dancing Moon, "they'll drag us back to paganism and savagery. Their spirits and ceremonies will pollute our children, turn them away from Christian salvation." It was then that Pastor Williams stepped forward, his usually gentle voice carrying an authority that few had heard from him before. Dixon Wheeler, in 30 years of ministry, I've never heard anything more contrary to Christ's teachings than what you just said. Jesus healed the sick without asking about their race or religion. He worked with anyone who could bring comfort. To the suffering, you speak of Christian salvation while pointing a gun at a man trying to save children's lives. The pastor's words carried weight that even Wheeler's fanaticism couldn't dismiss entirely. Several of his supporters began backing away, their faces troubled by the contradiction between their proclaimed faith and the hatred they were being asked to embrace. Samuel used the moment of confusion to move toward the Williams family house, where the twin boys lay unconscious, their parents maintaining a desperate vigil. Dancing Moon walked beside him, her bundle of medicines clutched against her chest, her young face set with determination that transcended fear. But Wheeler's desperation drove him to one final, unforgivable act. As Samuel reached for the door handle of the Williams house, Wheeler raised his pistol and fired a shot into the air, the report echoing off the surrounding buildings like thunder in the still winter afternoon. "Stop right there!" he screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria. "I'll shoot anyone who enters that house to perform unholy rituals on Christian children. This madness ends now." The gunshot galvanized the crowd in ways that words had failed to achieve. Some scattered in panic, others pressed forward with angry determination, but everyone understood that the conflict had moved beyond debate into the realm of potential tragedy. Sheriff Bradley drew his own weapon, his professional calm, masking the fury of a lawman watching his community tear itself apart. "Dixon, you're under arrest for threatening violence, disturbing the peace, and interfering with medical treatment," Bradley announced. "Put down your weapon and step away from the doctor." But Wheeler was beyond reason, beyond law, beyond everything, except the desperate need to prevent what he saw as the corruption of everything he held sacred. His finger tightened on the trigger as he aimed directly at Samuel's chest, his face twisted with the kind of hatred that destroys souls long before it destroys bodies. The shot that followed came not from Wheeler's gun, but from an unexpected source. Dr. James Wheeler, the young physician who had tried to enforce a quarantine just hours earlier, tackled his older brother from behind, sending Dixon's aim wild and his shot harmless into the sky. The two men crashed to the ground in a tangle of limbs, fighting for control of the weapon while the crowd watched in stunned silence. "Enough!" James Wheeler shouted as he wrestled the gun away from his brother. "I became a doctor to save lives, not to watch children die because of politics and prejudice. Dixon, you're sick, sicker than any of these children. Your hate has poisoned your mind." The younger Wheeler's intervention broke the spell that had held the crowd in thrall to his brother's fanaticism. Parents who had been wavering between fear and hope suddenly surged forward, carrying children who needed treatment, demanding that Samuel be allowed to work without further interference. Samuel wasted no time capitalizing on the shift in community sentiment. He entered the Williams house to find both twins deep in fevered unconsciousness, their small bodies racked with tremors that spoke of neurological systems under severe stress. But he also brought with him everything he had learned during his mountain exile, the combination of scientific knowledge and traditional wisdom that had already proven its worth with Billy Patterson and the Kiowa children. Dancing Moon worked beside him with the fluid efficiency of someone trained from childhood in healing arts, her hands steady as she prepared the traditional medicines while Samuel monitored the boy's vital signs with modern instruments. The room filled with the scent of burning sage and cedar, aromatic compounds that served both ceremonial and practical purposes in creating an environment conducive to healing. "Their spirits are lost deeper than Billy's was," Dancing Moon observed, her hand resting on the forehead of the older twin. "They've been sick longer, traveled farther into the shadow place. It will take stronger medicine to call them back." Samuel nodded, understanding that stronger medicine meant not just higher, dosages, but a more complete integration of healing approaches. He began to sing, softly, almost under his breath, melodies that Dancing Moon had taught him during their mountain work, songs that carried meanings beyond words, rhythms that seemed to resonate with something deeper than conscious thought. Outside, the community was witnessing its own form of healing as the artificial divisions that had nearly torn it apart began to dissolve under the pressure of shared crisis and common humanity. Neighbors who had been shouting at each other moments earlier now worked together to organize care for the sick children, preparing houses to serve as temporary hospitals, gathering supplies that would be needed for extended treatment. Martha Wessington, despite her advanced age, took charge of coordinating food and shelter for the families whose children required round-the-clock care. Jake Morrison organized men to gather firewood and keep the treatment centers warm. Even Mrs. Eleanor Hawthorne, who had initially supported Wheeler's opposition, found herself preparing broths and teas under Dancing Moon's gentle instruction, learning that healing wisdom could come from unexpected sources. The Williams twins' recovery was slower than Billy Patterson's had been, their return to consciousness marked by gradual stages rather than dramatic moments. But as the evening wore on, first one and then the other began responding to their names, their eyes focusing with increasing clarity, their breathing becoming less labored as the combined treatments took effect. Samuel moved through the town, like a man reborn, visiting each sick child, adapting his treatment protocols to individual needs while maintaining the core approach that blended scientific rigor with traditional wisdom. Dancing Moon accompanied him everywhere, her presence serving as a bridge between worlds that had been kept artificially separate for too long. At the Kiowa settlement on the eastern edge of the valley, Grandmother Willow Song waited with the dignity of someone who had lived long enough to see many cycles of conflict and resolution. When Samuel and Dancing Moon arrived to check on the children who had remained there, she greeted them with words that carried the weight of prophecy fulfilled. "The silent healer has found his voice again," she said in English carefully chosen, for Samuel's understanding. But more than that, he has learned to hear the voices of others, the voices that speak healing in languages his books never taught him. Samuel bowed his head in acknowledgement of wisdom that had taken him 3 years of isolation to begin understanding. "Grandmother, your medicines saved not just the children, but something in me that I thought was lost forever. How can I repay such a gift?" The old woman's eyes twinkled with humor that transcended cultural boundaries. "By remembering that healing is not something one person does alone, by teaching other doctors that wisdom comes from many sources, by never again thinking that you must carry all the suffering by yourself." As dawn broke over Medicine Creek Township after the longest night in its history, the final count of recovered children stood at 16, 9 Kiowa young ones who had climbed a mountain seeking help, 7 town children who had been pulled back from the edge of death by medicine that honored both tradition and innovation. The only casualty had been Rebecca Stone, the 4-year-old whose death had galvanized the community's desperate search for healing. Her funeral, conducted jointly by Pastor Williams and Grandmother Willow Song, became not just a farewell to one small life, but a ceremony of community healing that acknowledged both loss and gratitude, both sorrow and hope. Samuel stood beside Rebecca's grave as dirt fell on a small coffin, feeling the familiar ache of loss, but also something new. The understanding that even healers cannot save everyone, but that attempting to heal honors both the living and the dead. Emma's voice seemed to whisper in the wind that rustled through the cemetery's bare trees, reminding him that love expressed through service to others creates connections that transcend physical death. Dr. Holbrook returned from the mountain with the remaining Kiowa children, All of them recovered enough to travel, his own medical practice forever changed by what he had learned about the intersection of science and spirit, knowledge and wisdom, healing and faith. He approached Samuel with the humility of someone who had discovered the limits of his own understanding and found those limits to be doorways rather than walls. "Samuel, I'd like to continue learning from you if you're willing to teach," Holbrook said, his request carrying none of the arrogance that had once marked his professional demeanor. "What I've witnessed these past days has shown me that my medical education, thorough as it was, left out some of the most important aspects of healing." Samuel smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face in ways that reminded observers of the man he had been before grief carved channels through his heart. "Marcus, I think we can learn from each other. Modern medicine has tools and knowledge that traditional healing can benefit from, just as traditional approaches offer insights that medical schools haven't begun to explore. The children who recovered did so because we stopped insisting that different kinds of knowledge had to be enemies." Dixon Wheeler, facing charges for threatening violence and interfering with medical treatment, would spend the next several months in the territorial prison, his political influence broken by his willingness to let children die rather than allow healing methods he couldn't control. His brother James remained in Medicine Creek Township, his own medical practice now informed by a humility and openness that made him a far better doctor than his degrees alone had ever achieved. The integration of healing approaches that had saved the children's lives became a model for other frontier communities struggling with similar challenges. Word spread of the doctor who had learned to work with Native American healers, of treatments that honored both scientific rigor and traditional wisdom, of a community that had chosen healing over hatred when forced to make the choice. Samuel never returned to his mountain cabin except to retrieve his few possessions and close that chapter of his life with gratitude rather than regret. The isolation had been necessary, he now understood, not as an end in itself, but as preparation for a different kind of service, a deeper understanding of what it means to heal and be healed. His new practice, established in a clinic built jointly by the town and the Kiowa settlement, became a place where healing bridged cultures, where children of different backgrounds played together, while their parents learned that the love that drives medical care transcends racial boundaries, where the artificial divisions that had nearly cost so many lives dissolved under the practical necessity of working together to preserve life and health. Dancing Moon, as she grew older, became Samuel's first apprentice in what they called bridge medicine, approaches that honored multiple healing traditions while maintaining rigorous standards for effectiveness and safety. She learned to read both traditional symbols and modern medical charts, to prepare medicines that combined ancient knowledge with contemporary chemistry, to diagnose illness through methods that engaged both clinical observation and intuitive understanding. On quiet evenings, when the clinic was closed and the valley lay peaceful under starlight, Samuel would sometimes hear Elizabeth's laughter in the wind that came down from Whispering Ridge, would catch glimpses of Emma's smile in the faces of children whose lives had been saved by medicine that honored love as the ultimate healing force. The man who had once been called the silent healer had found his voice again, but more importantly, he had learned to listen to the wisdom of those who had never lost their connection to healing traditions, to the voices of children who spoke truth that adults had forgotten, to the whispers of love that echo across the boundaries between life and death, calling healers to remember that medicine, at its deepest level, is always an act of faith in the possibility that broken things can be made whole again. The snow continued to fall on Medicine Creek Township, but it no longer seemed like a covering that separated and isolated. Instead, it became a blanket that unified, a white page on which a community had written a new story about healing, about courage, about the bridges that can be built when people choose hope over fear, love over hatred, wisdom over ignorance, and somewhere in that gentle snowfall, in the laughter of recovered children and the grateful tears of their parents, in the smoke rising from chimneys where families gathered around fires of thankfulness, the spirits of Elizabeth and Emma Thornfield found their own form of healing, the knowledge that their husband and father had honored their memory by choosing to love again, to heal again, to believe again in the power of medicine, to transform not just bodies but hearts, not just individuals but entire communities. The silent mountain healer had spoken at last, and his words were deeds of love that echoed far beyond. The valley, carrying the message that healing, true healing, requires not just knowledge but wisdom, not just skill but compassion, not just courage, but the willingness to build bridges across every divide that separates human hearts from the love that calls them home. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.